New York City, the grand ballroom of the Blackwood Manhattan, the night of the 25th anniversary gala. 500 guests. One woman raises a champagne glass and smiles directly at the pregnant wife across the room. To powerful men who eventually learn which woman truly belongs beside them. Camille's eyes are locked on Laurel, patient, certain, waiting for her to break. Laurel sets down her water glass. She stands up. She walks across that ballroom slowly, steadily, 7 months pregnant, and asks her husband one question. The CFO goes white. Camille's smile freezes. This is the story of the wife nobody saw coming. Stay with me, because before this night is over, every single thing he thought he knew about his own success is going to change. The Blackwood Manhattan had been dressed for a celebration. Warm white lights covered the ballroom ceiling until the whole room looked like someone had caught a clear night sky and stretched it indoors. Nearly 500 guests filled every corner of the space. Investors in tailored suits, board members with practiced smiles, journalists nursing drinks near the back wall, not even pretending to stop watching. 25 years. That was what this evening was commemorating. A quarter-century of Blackwood hospitality. Adrian had been talking about it for months. Laurel arrived alone. She paused just inside the ballroom entrance, one hand resting lightly against her belly. 7 months along. Her dress was deep navy, carefully chosen, cut to accommodate the pregnancy without hiding it. Around her, people were already mid-conversation, mid-drink, mid-law. Nobody had expected to see her here. That much was obvious from the small moments of surprise on the faces closest to the door. Adrian had called that afternoon. His voice had the careful warmth it got when he had already made a decision and was working backward to make it sound considerate. He told her the evening would run long, that there were complicated negotiations in motion, that she needed rest. He said she should stay home. She told him she'd think about it. She thought about it for 40 minutes. Then she put on her dress. A server passed nearby and offered champagne from a silver tray. Laurel smiled and shook her head. She stood near the entrance and let her eyes move across the room slowly. The bar running along the west wall. The stage at the front, lit and ready. The cluster of photographers stationed near the east side. The long dinner tables with their ivory linens and gold centerpieces. Small engraved place cards marking where the important people were meant to sit. Then she found Adrian. He was standing near the stage with a tight circle of guests, holding his champagne with the relaxed confidence of a man who felt genuinely at home in a room full of people who admired him. His suit was charcoal gray and perfectly pressed. He was laughing at something someone had just said. He looked exactly like what he had spent 2 decades building himself into. A self-made man at his own party, completely at ease. Laurel's gaze moved to the woman beside him. Camille Devereaux stood close enough to make her position clear. Not aggressively close, just enough. She was polished in the specific way people are polished when they've studied it. Hair swept back, posture open. Her laugh came at exactly the right moments, and when she spoke, she touched Adrian's arm in that light, casual way that announces ownership without ever saying the word. Laurel noticed all of it. Then she noticed the necklace. It caught the light when Camille turned her head. A diamond pendant on a thin gold chain, delicate, tasteful. The exact piece that someone would describe as elegant and personal, because it was. 8 months ago, 3 days after the ultrasound, Adrian had come home carrying that particular energy he could never quite contain when something genuinely moved him. He sat beside Laurel on the edge of their bed and opened a small velvet box. He told her he wanted their daughter to have it someday. Something from before she was born. Something that said she was chosen before she had a chance to ask. Laurel had held it for a long time before she gave it back. She looked at it now against Camille's collarbone and felt something cold and final move through her. Not grief exactly, but the kind of quiet that arrives when your last remaining doubt is answered. She did not walk toward them. She found a chair near the far wall, sat down and watched. People greeted her as they passed. A board member's wife who stopped to ask about the due date. A hotel executive she recognized from an investor dinner. She answered each of them warmly, without any visible distress, the way you answer people when the thing you feel is too large to be expressed in small talk. Several guests glanced between her and Camille with the careful discomfort of people who understood exactly what they were looking at and didn't know what to do with that understanding. Laurel let them look. An hour passed. The stage lights brightened. The room gathered itself into attention. Adrian took the microphone. He was a good speaker, always had been. He had a gift for making 500 strangers feel like they were personally included in whatever he was building. He talked about 25 years of working through setbacks no one outside the company ever saw, about taking risks when the numbers looked impossible, about what loyalty meant inside a company that had survived things it probably shouldn't have. The room applauded in the right places. Then he thanked the people around him, his team, His CFO Marcus Bell received warm, genuine applause. Investors, advisors, people who had been with the company through hard stretches. Then he turned toward Camille. He called her invaluable, said the most important transaction in Blackwood Hospitality's history would not have moved forward without her vision and her relationships and her belief in what he was building. The words came out practiced but sincere, which was almost the hardest part to watch. Camille accepted the praise with a modest smile and a gracious nod, performing humility for the room with precision. Then Adrian handed her the microphone. Laurel watched her take it. Camille thanked him, talked about partnerships and shared ambition, and what it meant to work alongside someone whose drive was matched by his character. Every word was technically appropriate, professionally clean. Then she raised her champagne glass. "To the most important partnerships in our lives," Camille said. Her voice was even and clear, carrying easily to every table, every corner. "And to powerful men who eventually learn which woman truly belongs beside them." She smiled. The room went still, not silent, just still. The particular stillness that falls over a crowd when something has been said that cannot be unsaid and everyone is waiting to see what comes next. Then the glances started. People turned with that careful sideways motion of guests who want to see without being caught seeing. Someone near the center touched their companion's elbow. Three people near the bar reached for their phones simultaneously. A journalist near the back wall stopped pretending her notepad had anything to do with financial reporting. Everyone looked toward Laurel. Camille was already looking at her. That was the entire point. The toast was delivered to the room, but it was built for exactly one person. Camille held Laurel's gaze across 500 guests and waited with the calm patience of someone who had already decided how this scene was going to end. She was waiting for Laurel to fall apart. She waited. Laurel set down her water glass. She stood up. She crossed the ballroom without rushing, moving around tables, briefly steadying herself with a hand on the back of a chair. People stepped aside without being asked. A few of them looked at the floor as she passed. One woman she didn't recognize gave her a look that might have been sympathy, or might have been fascination. Laurel moved through all of it and reached the front of the room. Adrian stepped down from the stage to intercept her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing what they always did when he was trying to get ahead of something before it got ahead of him. "Laurel." Low voice. Private. Warning. "Don't embarrass yourself." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him. Marcus Bell was standing off to the side of the stage, holding a glass of champagne he had clearly stopped drinking. He was a large, composed man, 11 years as CFO, steady in every room she had ever watched him in. He was someone who had spent a decade making sure his face showed only what he decided to show. Right now, his face was showing something else. Laurel turned back to her husband, Adrian. Her voice was steady, quiet enough to be private, clear enough to be heard by the people standing close. "Did you execute the Devereaux agreement yet?" It landed differently depending on where you were standing. Camille stopped smiling for exactly one beat before the smile returned, sharper now. She looked at Laurel with the expression of someone who has encountered a variable they did not plan for. Adrian blinked. Marcus Bell went pale, quietly, completely. He set his glass down on the nearest table with a small, precise motion and looked at Laurel the way a person looks when they hear a name they were not expecting anyone in the room to know. She saw it, filed it away without showing that she had. Adrian's confusion shifted back toward irritation. He asked how she even knew about the Devereaux agreement. Laurel didn't answer that. She waited. "It'll be signed before midnight," he said. The certainty in his voice was the certainty of a man who needed to be in charge of something. "It's the right deal. It protects the company." "Don't sign it." Camille stepped forward slightly. Nothing aggressive, just enough to reinsert herself into the center of the conversation. She arranged her expression into something soft and patient, tilted her head, and spoke to Laurel in a voice calibrated for an audience. "Laurel," she said, "you've had a long evening. Pregnancy is exhausting. No one expects you to follow the details of something this complicated." A few people nearby heard it. Laurel watched their faces register it. She did not react to Camille. She did not look at her. She looked at her husband, and when she spoke, her voice was even and unhurried and just loud enough. "If you sign that agreement tonight, Adrian, tomorrow morning you may discover that you no longer control the company you're celebrating." The words dropped into the space between them. Adrian went very still. He stood there looking at her with the expression of a man trying to decide whether he had misheard something, or whether the woman standing in front of him had just said something she couldn't possibly mean. Around them, the guests who were close enough to have caught the exchange had gone very quiet. Camille's smile stayed in place. But at the edges, something in it had tightened. Marcus Bell did not move at all. Laurel held her husband's gaze for another moment. She had said what she came to say. There was nothing left to add. She turned and walked back through the crowd toward the side exit, at the same unhurried pace she'd arrived with. Nobody called after her. She pushed through the door and into the long corridor beyond the ballroom. The noise of 500 people dropped to a low, muffled hum behind her. The air out here was cooler and carried the faint smell of the hotel's ventilation system, and someone's expensive cologne left behind on the carpet. It was very quiet. Her phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen. Naomi Reeves, her attorney, her closest friend since law school, a woman who communicated with the economy of someone who had stopped wasting words a long time ago. One sentence. If he signs before midnight, North Star's conversion rights automatically trigger. Laurel stood in the corridor and read it twice. She already knew this. She had known it for weeks. Naomi was not telling her something new. She was confirming that a clock was running. Laurel looked back at the ballroom door. Through the narrow window in it, she could see the blur of movement inside. The lights, the guests, the smooth, expensive surface of a world that had just watched a man's wife warn him about the consequences of his own choices, while several of them filmed it on their phones. She thought about the last 2 years. The late nights at her desk, going through Blackwood Hospitality's financials and documents Adrian didn't know she had access to. The calls with Naomi about covenant language and conversion triggers, and the particular patience required when you are protecting someone who doesn't know they're being protected. The invisible, careful, thankless work of making sure that when a real crisis came, someone with real leverage was already in position. She had done all of it without telling him. She had told herself it was love. She had told herself it was protection. Standing in the corridor now, with Naomi's message glowing on her screen, she allowed herself to consider something she had been avoiding for a long time. She had kept Adrian's rescue a secret because she believed she was protecting his pride. But part of her had also been afraid. Afraid that if he ever understood how often she had quietly caught him, he would never forgive her for it. That knowing she had seen his weakness would become a wall between them he could never stop looking at. So she had kept it from him. And that silence had given his arrogance room to grow into something she could no longer recognize as the man she married. She pressed her palm flat against her belly. A habit now, automatic, something she did without deciding to. Her daughter moved under her hand. Laurel exhaled slowly. She looked at Naomi's message one more time. Inside the ballroom, Adrian was about to sign the worst agreement of his professional life, and the only person in that room who fully understood why had just been publicly managed out the door by his mistress. The question was not whether Laurel had the power to stop him. The question was whether stopping him again quietly, invisibly, one more time, was love, or whether it was just a more elegant version of letting him keep falling. She did not respond to Naomi's message. She put her phone in her purse, pressed the elevator button, and stood in the corridor alone while the night continued without her inside it. The corridor outside the ballroom was long and carpeted in deep burgundy, lit by brass wall sconces spaced evenly apart. At this hour, it should have been empty. Staff used the service passages on the east side of the building. Guests used the main lobby. Adrian used neither. He came through the side door less than 2 minutes after Laurel did, moving fast, his footsteps muffled by the carpet but his presence unmistakable. He stopped when he saw her standing near the elevator bank still, her phone in her purse, her eyes on the floor indicator above the doors. Laurel, she turned. His expression was doing several things at once, none of them quite adding up to anything coherent. There was anger in it, the immediate kind that comes from being caught off guard in front of an audience. There was also something underneath that, something more uneasy. "What was that?" he asked. She waited. "You walked up there in front of 500 people and said something about my company that you have no business saying, and then you just walked out." He crossed his arms. "I need to know what that was. I told you not to sign the agreement. You said if I signed it, I'd lose control of my company. Those are not the same thing as don't sign." His voice was low and deliberate, the voice he used when he wanted to sound measured and was working hard at it. "How do you know about the Devereaux transaction?" Laurel studied him for a moment. She had asked herself, on the elevator ride up to the 14th floor that afternoon, what she would say if it came to this. She had been preparing for this conversation in some form for a long time. There were a dozen ways to enter it. Some of them were honest, some of them were strategic, some of them were both. She chose the simplest one. "Camille's family isn't coming to rescue Blackwood," she said. "They're coming to dismantle it." He blinked. "They want access to the 2 hotels on Madison and the property in Midtown," she continued. "The Devereaux valuation doesn't reflect what those assets are actually worth. That's not an accident. That's the whole point." Adrian stared at her. She could see him working through it, sorting through the implications, running the conflict between what she was saying and what he already believed against each other. Then the working through stopped. "That's not what this is," he said. "Adrian Camille has been in these negotiations for months. I've seen the numbers. Our advisors have seen the numbers." He uncrossed his arms. "You haven't been in a single meeting. You have no idea what's in those documents. I know what I know. Which is what, exactly? What are you basing this on? She didn't answer that. His jaw shifted. Did someone tell you something? One of Marcus's people? Because if there's a leak in the CFO's office, there's no leak. Then where's this coming from? Laurel held his gaze. She knew what she could say. She had said it to herself enough times. The whole explanation, start to finish, what North Star was, what she'd built, what she'd done, why she'd done it without telling him. She could say all of it right now in this corridor, while the party continued 40 feet away and 500 people waited on the other side of a wall. She knew what his face would do when she said it. That was the part she couldn't get past. This was his anniversary, his night. The celebration of 25 years he had described for months as the proudest moment of his professional life. And she could not make herself be the person who walked into that and said, "You haven't been as alone as you think. And by the way, the biggest crisis of your career survived because I caught you." Maybe that was protecting him. Maybe it was protecting herself from watching him decide how to feel about it. She wasn't entirely sure anymore. "Just don't sign it tonight," she said. "That's all I'm asking. Wait until morning. Have someone look at the covenant language in your existing agreements before you put your name on anything else. You're asking me to stop a transaction that took 6 months to structure because of a feeling you have. It's not a feeling. Then tell me what it is." The side door opened. Camille stepped into the corridor. She looked between the two of them with the quick professional assessment of someone who has walked into interruptions before and understands exactly how to reframe them. Her expression settled into something warm and concerned, directed at Adrian, with a secondary layer of patient tolerance aimed at Laurel. "I thought I might find you both out here," she said. "Is everything all right?" Adrian turned toward her. The shift in his posture was small but visible. The tightness in his shoulders came down slightly, the way it does when someone steps into a room you associate with comfort. Laurel saw it. "We're talking," Adrian said. "Of course." Camille folded her hands together in front of her, the precise gesture of a person who is being respectful of a private conversation while making it clear she isn't going anywhere. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. People inside are asking where you are. Give me a minute." Camille nodded. Then she looked at Laurel, not hostilely, almost sympathetically, which was worse. "Laurel, I want to say again that I'm sorry about the toast. I should have been more careful with my wording. I didn't mean to put you in an uncomfortable position." She paused just long enough for it to land. "I understand this must be a stressful evening for you. You're 7 months along, it's late, and a room full of business conversations isn't exactly the right environment for." "I'm fine," Laurel said. "Of course you are." Camille smiled, quiet and brief. Then she turned back to Adrian. "She's been so patient with everything. It's admirable, really. She's never wanted to be involved in the business side of things. That's completely valid. Not everyone has the appetite for it." Adrian said nothing. Camille continued. "It's just that decisions like the Devereaux Agreement involve years of relationship building and very specific financial architecture that takes months to evaluate properly. Laurel hasn't been in any of those conversations, which makes complete sense given everything else on her plate." Another small pause. "I only mention it because I'd hate for her concern to slow something down that the whole team has worked so hard to get to the finish line." The corridor was quiet. Laurel watched Adrian process that. She watched the small, almost invisible relaxation that came over him as Camille's version of events settled into place. It was not dramatic. It was not obvious. It was the microscopic physics of a man returning to a story about himself that felt more comfortable than the one his wife was offering. Camille had understood him perfectly. That was the thing Laurel had underestimated for too long. It wasn't luck or chemistry or simple desire. Camille had studied him. She knew exactly where his confidence was genuine, and exactly where it was borrowed from whoever was standing nearest him. She had figured out months ago that the fastest route to Adrian Blackwood's decisions was through his need to be believed in, and she had been feeding that need every single day. Adrian turned back to Laurel. "What could you possibly understand," he said slowly, "about what it takes to save a company?" The question came out quietly, not with cruelty. That was almost the most painful part. It came out the way a question comes out when the person asking it genuinely believes the answer is nothing. He was not trying to wound her. He was simply asking what appeared to him to be an obvious and reasonable question. Laurel looked at her husband. She looked at the face she had slept beside for 8 years. The face she had watched carry real fear during the worst 18 months of Blackwood Hospitality's financial history. The face she had watched rebuild itself into confidence while she quietly made sure the ground underneath him was solid enough to stand on. She thought about the North Star document sitting in a locked drawer in her Midtown office. The emails between her and Naomi going back nearly 2 years. The calls with analysts. The 3 separate occasions she had personally authorized additional liquidity because the company's banking partners had quietly declined to extend their exposure. She opened her mouth, then she closed it. She would not do it here. Not in a hotel corridor while Camille stood 6 feet away cataloging every word. Not on the night of his anniversary gala, in front of a celebration he had been building toward for months. She would not take the proudest story he told about himself and rewrite it in the worst possible moment. That was her flaw, and she knew it, and she couldn't stop it. She looked at Adrian directly. Do not sign Camille's agreement tonight. He looked back at her for a long moment. Then he turned, walked past Camille, and pushed the side door open back into the noise of the ballroom. Camille followed without a word. Laurel stood in the corridor alone. She pressed the elevator button a second time, went down to the lobby, got into a car, and went home. The house was quiet when she arrived. The living room lights were on a timer. She sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and her phone face down on the table, and watched the second hand on the clock above the stove move through its circuit without doing anything else. At 11:43, her phone lit up. Naomi. She answered before the second ring. He signed it, Naomi said. Laurel put the glass down. Final transfer documentation and everything supplemental, Naomi continued. Complete execution. The Devereaux side countersigned digitally within minutes. They were ready and waiting. Of course they were. There was a brief silence on the line. The covenant breach is confirmed, Naomi said. The moment he executed the supplemental transfer provisions that triggered Article 9 of North Star's agreement, the protection clause is active. Laurel turned the glass in a slow circle against the kitchen table. What do you want to do? Naomi asked. What are our options? Same ones we've had. We can sit on it. Let the breach stand without acting, which gives us leverage, but doesn't resolve the Devereaux exposure. Or, Naomi paused briefly. We initiate conversion proceedings. North Star converts a portion of the debt into equity. If we do it right, we end up with a controlling position. And if we do it wrong, it sends a control change signal to the primary bank. They could freeze the revolving credit facility while they evaluate the new ownership structure. Blackwood would need a liquidity bridge almost immediately. If they can't secure one fast enough, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Laurel knew the number. She had run it 3 different ways over the past 2 weeks. Without access to that credit facility, Blackwood Hospitality's working capital dried up within weeks. Payroll for several hundred employees became a real question. People who had nothing to do with any of this. Laurel stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. The backyard was dark. The motion sensor light over the garage had clicked off. Somewhere in the neighbor's yard, a wind chime was moving in a light breeze. She thought about what Marcus Bell's face had done tonight. That immediate controlled pallor. The careful way he had set down his champagne glass. 11 years of CFO experience, and the question she had asked in a public room had still landed visibly. Marcus knew. He knew what the Devereaux valuation was actually doing. He knew the 2 Manhattan hotels were worth significantly more than the price Camille had negotiated. He had probably tried to say so because that was the job he had done loyally for over a decade, and Adrian had probably told him to trust the process. Trust Camille's process, because Camille had spent months making sure she was the voice Adrian trusted. Laurel stood at the window and let herself see the whole picture clearly, maybe for the first time. This was never just an affair. The affair was the mechanism, the access point. Camille had recognized Adrian's particular brand of insecurity early, and she had walked toward it deliberately. His hunger for praise wasn't a flaw she had stumbled across. It was the door she had looked for. She praised his instincts. She validated his risk tolerance. She told him in 100 small ways that he was the kind of man who saw things other people missed. And while she was doing that, her family's firm was quietly getting into position. 2 undervalued Manhattan properties, a discounted acquisition structured under the cover of a rescue deal, and an affair that gave Camille the emotional proximity to shepherd Adrian to the signing table at exactly the right moment. Laurel had been watching the affair. She should have been watching the calendar. Laurel. Naomi's voice was patient and level on the phone. Tell me what you want to do. Laurel looked through the dark window at the yard. She thought about Blackwood Hospitality. Not the brand, not the valuation. The building she was standing a mile from right now, lit up for a party, with catering staff breaking down tables and security walking the parking structure, and the overnight front desk team running the kind of quiet professional operation that happens every night whether or not the owner is celebrating. She thought about the employees. Then she thought about what her mother had told her once about building something durable. Her mother had said that real power was never loud, that the most important decisions you made were usually the ones nobody else saw you make. Laurel turned away from the window. Prepare the conversion notice, she said. A beat of silence. All right, Naomi said. I can have it ready within the hour. Do you want me to file it tonight? Laurel stood in the kitchen of the house that still smelled faintly like Adrian's cologne from that morning in the home they had built together across 8 years, carrying his daughter, holding the phone that connected her to the single most consequential financial decision of her life. Not yet. Naomi waited. He signed the agreement tonight without fully understanding what he was signing, Laurel said. I want to give him one chance to understand it before anything is filed. Laurel, Naomi's voice was careful. If you wait too long, I know the window. The bank's monitoring systems will flag the covenant breach within 48 hours at most. Once they see it independently, we lose control of the sequence. I know. Another silence. One chance, Laurel said. I'm giving him one chance to see what actually happened tonight. After that, we proceed. She heard Naomi exhale slowly on the other end. The notice will be ready, Naomi said. You call me. I'll call you. She hung up. The kitchen clock moved its second hand through another circuit. The wind chime outside had gone still. The motion sensor light over the garage clicked back on for a moment, triggered by something in the yard she couldn't see, then clicked off again. Laurel stood in the quiet house. Somewhere inside her, her daughter shifted. A small movement, private, unrepeatable. The kind of thing that reminds you, in the middle of the largest decisions of your life, that there is something even larger happening in the background. She pressed her palm flat against her side. Then she picked up the phone, navigated to Naomi's last message and reread it one more time. After that, she went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time without sleeping, looking at the ceiling of the bedroom where she had spent 8 years beside a man who had somehow, in the process of becoming successful, stopped being able to see her clearly. She was not angry. That surprised her a little. She had expected anger. What she felt instead was closer to grief. The specific grief that arrives when something you hoped wasn't true turns out to have been true for longer than you knew. She had protected him because she loved him, and she had loved him so quietly, so carefully, so invisibly, that he had mistaken her protection for absence. He had looked at her patience and seen a woman with nothing to contribute. He had looked at her silence and seen someone who didn't understand the room. She had made him that mistake possible. That was the part she would have to sit with, not just what he had done, what she had helped build, without meaning to, by keeping herself out of every frame. She closed her eyes. Across the city, in the Manhattan flagship hotel, where 500 people had spent the evening celebrating his name on a building, Adrian Blackwood was making decisions about his company in a room where everyone who agreed with him was either an employee or a woman who wanted something from him. And the person who actually understood his balance sheet was lying in the dark, waiting for him to call. Her phone stayed silent. She had not expected otherwise. But she lay there for another hour, just in case. The first video appeared before 7 in the morning. 12 seconds. Shot from somewhere near the center of the ballroom, slightly angled, catching the stage lights in the crowd, and Camille's raised champagne glass with the kind of casual clarity that only expensive phone cameras produce. The audio was compressed and a little muddy, but the words came through. To powerful men who eventually learn which woman truly belongs beside them. Then a cut. Someone had spliced it with a second clip from a different angle, this one lower, catching Laurel's face from across the room. She was looking directly at Camille. Her expression was still. Her hands were in her lap. Her pregnancy was visible in every frame. By 8 o'clock, the video had been shared 11,000 times. By 9, the financial press had picked it up. The captions were not kind. Blackwood Hospitality CEO's Mistress toasts his pregnant wife at anniversary gala. One tabloid ran a photograph of Adrian and Camille standing together at the podium, alongside a separate photo of Laurel standing alone beneath the ballroom lights. The contrast was deliberate and brutal. She looked isolated in it. She looked like someone who had arrived at the wrong party and had not yet found a polite way to leave. Laurel saw all of it from the kitchen table. She had been up since 5:30. She had made tea she hadn't finished and sat with her laptop open, moving through the coverage methodically the way you read something, when you are trying to understand the full shape of it before you decide how to respond. She read the business press accounts. She read the social media threads. She read the comment sections, which was probably a mistake, but she read them anyway. People had opinions. They always did. Some were angry on her behalf. Some were fascinated. Some had already decided, based on 12 seconds of video and 2 photographs, that they understood everything about her marriage, her husband, and what she should do next. She closed the laptop at 9:45. Adrian arrived at 10. He rang the bell, which told her something by itself. He had a key. He knew the code. He rang the bell because ringing the bell was a gesture, and Adrian understood gestures better than most people understood language. She let him in. He had not slept. That was clear from the moment she saw him. His suit from the night before had been exchanged for something fresh, but the face above it looked like a man who had been running calculations in his head for the past several hours and had not arrived at any number he liked. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I assume you've seen the coverage," he said. Yes, he nodded. He was looking at the table surface rather than at her. He put his phone face down on the table, which was a thing he did when he wanted to signal that he was fully present and not distracted, and which usually meant he had already looked at his phone approximately 40 times in the past hour. The board is concerned, he said. The PR team has been calling since 6. There are interviews scheduled for the hospitality conference next week, and 2 of our investors have already reached out wanting to understand the situation. He paused. The optics are not good. Laurel looked at him. The optics, she said. He glanced up briefly. Something in her voice had caught him. I'm not minimizing what happened. I'm telling you that there are professional consequences we both need to think about. You came here to talk about the professional consequences. He shifted in his chair. I came here because we need to figure out how to handle this. She waited. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. He set it on the table. He did not push it toward her. He simply placed it in the space between them and left it there. I spoke with my attorney this morning, he said. He drafted something preliminary, a confidential separation agreement. It would cover living arrangements, financial provision during the pregnancy, and a framework for co-parenting after the birth. Everything handled privately. He finally looked at her directly. No press, no public statements. Both of us protected from further exposure. Laurel did not touch the document. She sat across from her husband of 8 years and looked at the face she had chosen and the folded paper he had brought to her kitchen table and the word he had used. Protected. Protected from exposure. Not protected from pain or from error or from the truth of what he had actually done. Protected from the way it looked. She let the silence run. Then she asked him something.
If I weren't carrying your child, would you still know anything about the woman sitting across from you?
He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He looked at her. Really looked at her. Maybe for the first time in a long time. She watched him try to locate an answer. She watched him search for one that was honest and also manageable. Something that acknowledged the question without fully opening the door behind it. He couldn't find it. She had watched Adrian Blackwood talk his way through financial crises, board challenges, and investor confrontations that would have unraveled most people. She had watched him find words when words seemed impossible. This was the first time she had seen him search for something to say to her and come back with nothing at all. That answer was its own kind of answer. She stood up from the table. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for the document or push it back at him. She picked up her teacup, carried it to the sink, rinsed it, and set it in the drying rack. I need you to leave, she said. I'll have Naomi contact your attorney about the separation agreement. Laurel, I'm not angry, Adrian. She turned around. I want you to understand that. I'm not standing here furious. I'm standing here finished. She paused. There's a difference. He stood up. He looked like he wanted to say something that would change the weight of the room. She could see it in him, the impulse toward the right line, the decisive statement that reframes everything. He had survived his entire career on moments like that. He had nothing. He picked up his phone and the document from the table. He stood at the kitchen door for a moment, and she could feel him trying to decide whether to try once more. He didn't. He left. She heard the front door close. She heard his car in the driveway. She stood at the kitchen sink with both hands on the counter and looked through the window at the backyard and breathed. Then she called Naomi. Tell me you're at the office, she said. I've been here since 7:30, Naomi said. When did you sleep? Get the team together. I'm coming in. She was in Midtown by noon. The offices of North Star Legacy Partners occupied the upper floors of a building on 52nd Street. Clean glass and polished concrete in the lobby. An elevator bank that opened directly into a reception area where the walls held no artwork, only white space, which had been a deliberate choice on Laurel's part. Her mother had told her once that flashy offices were for companies that needed to convince people they were serious. Serious companies spent the money on actual work. The receptionist at the front desk looked up when Laurel stepped off the elevator. Good afternoon, Miss Blackwood. Afternoon. Is Naomi in the East boardroom? Yes, ma'am. The analysts are already in there. Laurel thanked her and walked the corridor. She passed 4 offices, each occupied by people who looked up from their screens as she moved past, not because they were startled, because she was the person whose opinion shaped every significant decision in this building. And when she walked in after a situation had been developing overnight, people paid attention. 3 of them said good morning. One of the junior analysts held up a stack of printed documents she recognized as covenant materials and tilted his head in a question. She nodded once, which meant bring them. He stood up from his desk and followed.
North Star Legacy Partners had not always looked like this.
Her mother, Eleanor Bennett, had built the original fund across 20 years of careful, patient work. Eleanor was a woman who had learned finance during an era when women in that industry were expected to take up as little space as possible, and she had responded by becoming better than anyone in her proximity. She had built North Star from a small private vehicle into something durable and sophisticated. Then she died 4 years ago and left it to Laurel. The firm had gone quiet in the year after Eleanor's death. Not collapsed, just quiet. The senior partners managed the existing portfolio carefully. A few investments matured. Nothing new went in. The world interpreted that as a holding pattern. Laurel spent that year doing something different. She spent it grieving her mother. She spent it going through 20 years of Eleanor's notes and strategies and correspondence. She spent it learning the full interior of a company she had always admired from the outside, the actual mechanics of it, the relationships, the contractual architecture, the places where her mother had taken risks, and the places where she had been deliberately conservative. By the second year, Laurel knew North Star better than anyone else alive. By the time she decided to use it to purchase Blackwood Hospitality's distressed debt, she had run the analysis 4 separate times. It had not been an impulsive decision. She had watched Adrian's company approach a genuine liquidity crisis over the course of several months. She had seen the bank communications he never mentioned at home. She had known, through channels he didn't know she had access to, that 2 lenders had quietly declined to extend further credit. She could have told him. She had considered it. She had sat with the idea of going to him directly, of saying, "I know what's happening. I have the resources to help. Let's work through this together." She had imagined what that conversation would look like, and she had known with a precision that hurt her to admit exactly how he would receive it. He would have felt exposed. He would have felt diminished. The man who had built his identity around self-made success would have looked at his wife offering him a financial rescue and experienced it as the worst kind of failure. He would have said no. He probably would have resented her for knowing enough to offer. So she did it the other way. She structured the debt purchase through North Star, anonymous enough to provide distance, patient enough to give the company room to breathe. The terms were fair, actually fair, not charity. She had made sure of that specifically because she was not trying to own the outcome. She was trying to give him time. For nearly 2 years it had worked. And now she sat in the boardroom of her mother's company, at the head of a long table covered in covenant documents and financial models, while 4 senior analysts walked her through exactly how much the situation had shifted in the past 18 hours. Naomi sat beside her. She had a yellow notepad with 3 columns of notes and a pen she had not put down since Laurel arrived. "The primary bank's monitoring system will flag the covenant breach automatically," said David Park, North Star's head of credit analysis. He was methodical and fast, exactly the trait she paid for. "Our estimate is 48 hours, maybe 72 if their weekend review cycle delays the flag. What happens when they see it? They'll request clarification from Blackwood's treasury team. That communication will make the breach semi-public within the banking group. Once that happens,
The revolving credit facility gets reviewed for suspension. Naomi finished.
at minimum reviewed, likely suspended pending resolution." David tapped the document in front of him. "Without that facility, Blackwood needs an alternative liquidity source quickly. Their operating cash covers roughly 3 to 4 weeks of expenses at current burn." "Payroll is in week 2, said another analyst, a woman named Sarah Cho who ran North Star's risk models. 412 employees. Laurel looked at the number. She had known the approximate figure. Seeing it on a printed page inside a formal analysis was different from knowing it in the abstract. 412 people who showed up to work every day at Blackwood Hospitality and had nothing to do with champagne toasts or diamond necklaces or asset sales, structured to benefit a family she had never met. "If we initiate conversion now," she said, "what's the containment window?" Sarah walked her through the sequencing. Fast conversion, maximum leverage, potential to establish controlling equity before the bank suspended the facility. But the control change signal to the bank would come simultaneously. The very action that gave North Star leverage over the company would also be the trigger that put the company's cash access at risk. "There's no clean order of operations," David said. "Any path we take involves some exposure for the employees. How much exposure depends on how quickly we can arrange a bridge," Naomi added. She looked at Laurel. "Which depends on how much capital you want to put at risk personally." The room went quiet. Laurel looked at the table. This was the decision her mother's notes had never addressed directly, because Eleanor had never been in exactly this position. But she had written something once, in the margins of a risk assessment document that Laurel had found folded inside an old folder, in handwriting that was cramped and quick and completely characteristic. She had written, "The question is never whether you can afford the risk. The question is whether you can afford to walk away from it." Laurel had read that 3 times before she understood that her mother was not talking about money. She looked at Naomi. "I'm not going to initiate conversion until Adrian has had a real opportunity to understand what the Devereaux transaction actually did. One clear opportunity, not a warning in a hotel corridor, a full explanation." She paused. If he acts on it and unwinds the agreement, we step back. The breach can be cured. That's the cleanest outcome for everyone. And if he doesn't, Naomi asked, then we proceed, and we figure out the bridge separately. Naomi wrote something on her notepad. I'll draft a formal communication to Blackwood's legal team, she said. North Star creditor correspondence. Specific, factual, no language that reveals your personal position yet. It'll put the Devereaux breach in front of their attorneys and give Adrian 24 hours to respond. Send it. Naomi was already dialing. Laurel sat at the head of the table for a moment after the analysts had moved to the side of the room, gathering materials and preparing to recalculate scenarios. She looked at the skyline through the tall windows. 52nd Street running below them, taxis and delivery trucks, and the ordinary movement of a city that continued its own business, regardless of what was happening in private rooms above it. She thought about the kitchen table this morning, the folded document sitting in the space between them, Adrian's face when he couldn't answer a question, the door closing. She had spent 8 years building two things simultaneously, a marriage and a company. She had kept them rigorously separate, partly out of love and partly out of fear, and that separation had allowed both to drift into territory she had not anticipated. She was going to stop separating them now. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Naomi's assistant knocked on the boardroom door. Naomi, we have an issue. Naomi looked up from the documents. What kind? The assistant was holding a printed email. Devereaux Capital's attorney sent something to Blackwood's board chair 20 minutes ago. It just got forwarded to us. She hesitated. They're claiming North Star has an undisclosed conflict of interest in its creditor position. They're alleging that North Star's debt accumulation was conducted using non-public information about Blackwood hospitality obtained through a personal relationship. The room went very still. David Park looked at Sarah Cho. Naomi set down her pen. Laurel did not move. They named me, she said, not as a question. Not directly, the assistant said. But the description is specific enough that anyone reading it would understand. Laurel was quiet for a moment. She had known this was possible. She had run this scenario, in different forms, several times over the past 2 years. The accusation had a shape to it. Parts of it were technically accurate, and parts of it were constructed from those accurate pieces in a way that implied a different story than the true one. Camille had found the pressure point and she had pressed it. The dangerous thing about the accusation was not that it was false. The dangerous thing was that it would force a confrontation Laurel had spent years building careful distance from. She looked around the table. Call the board chair, she said. Tell him North Star's representative needs to be present at whatever meeting they're scheduling. She looked at Naomi. And get me a seat at that table. Naomi reached for her phone. The emergency board meeting was called for 4 o'clock that afternoon. Laurel arrived early. The Blackwood Hospitality boardroom was on the 32nd floor of their corporate offices on Park Avenue. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. A long mahogany table with 12 chairs. A flat screen display on the north wall, still showing the logo from whatever presentation had last been projected there. She sat down on the right side of the table, 3 chairs from the head. She placed the conversion notice document in front of her, face down. She placed her phone to the left of it. She folded her hands and waited. Naomi settled in beside her without speaking. The room filled gradually. Board members arriving in ones and twos, each of them pausing almost imperceptibly when they saw Laurel already seated. A few of them looked at Naomi. A few looked at the documents in front of Laurel. Most of them looked at the chair she was sitting in, and then at the side of the table she was sitting on, and did the quiet math. Devereaux Capital's attorneys arrived, 3 of them. They sat on the opposite side of the table, arranged their materials, and did not make eye contact with anyone. Camille was not present. That was interesting. At 4:12, Adrian walked in. He was in a fresh suit navy, the one he wore when he needed to feel confident in a room. He came through the door already scanning, reading the arrangement of the space. He saw the Devereaux attorneys. He saw the empty chairs waiting for North Star's representatives. He was already building the structure of the meeting in his head, figuring out where each piece of the conflict was positioned. Then he saw Laurel. He stopped. Not at the entrance. He had already come 3 steps into the room. He stopped in the middle of the floor and stood there. She was not behind the lawyers. She was not among the observers near the wall. She was at North Star's side of the table, with her hands folded on the surface in front of her, and Naomi Reeves beside her, and a document face down where her place had been set, and she was looking directly at him. The room was quiet. Everyone was watching him absorb it. Adrian looked at his wife. Several seconds passed. "Why are you sitting there?" he asked. His voice was careful, very controlled. The voice of a man who has just seen something that rearranges several years of his understanding and is doing everything in his power not to show how much rearranging is happening. Laurel held his gaze across the mahogany table. "Because we finally need to talk about who kept your company alive." Camille arrived at 4:22. She walked into the boardroom with the composed energy of someone who had already decided the meeting was a formality. Two attorneys flanked her, both carrying document portfolios, both moving with the brisk efficiency of people who were billing by the hour and wanted the room to know it. She saw Laurel at the table. Something shifted briefly behind her eyes, gone before most people in the room would have caught it. Then she sat down across from the North Star side of the table, opened her portfolio, and arranged her materials with precise, unhurried movements. Adrian was already seated. He had taken the chair at the head of the table, which was technically appropriate for the CEO, and which also put him equidistant from both sides. He had not looked at Laurel since asking why she was sitting there. He was looking at the surface of the table directly in front of him. The board chair, a silver-haired man named Robert Feld, who had served Blackwood Hospitality for 14 years, called the meeting to order at 4:30. He outlined the situation with the clipped neutrality of someone who had managed corporate crises before and was not going to perform distress about this one. A covenant breach had occurred in the North Star lending agreement as a result of the previous evening's transaction. A conflict of interest allegation had been filed by Devereaux Capital. Both matters required board attention before close of business. Camille's lead attorney was on his feet before Feld finished the sentence. His name was Harris. He had the particular confidence of a lawyer who had won enough rooms to stop worrying about whether he would win this one. He started with the allegation and built outward from it. He moved efficiently, presenting the core argument in clean language designed for a board audience rather than a courtroom. North Star Legacy Partners, he said, had accumulated a significant creditor position in Blackwood Hospitality over a period of nearly 2 years. During that same period, the principal decision-maker at North Star had been in a marital relationship with the CEO of Blackwood Hospitality. That relationship provided potential access to non-public financial information about the company. The accumulation of debt under those circumstances raised serious questions about whether the creditor position was properly disclosed and whether it could be legitimately enforced. He placed printed documents on the table and slid copies down both sides. Board members reached for them. Adrian looked at the first page without touching it. Feld asked if North Star's representative wished to respond. Naomi said not yet. Harris continued. He argued that Laurel's position at North Star, given her marriage to Adrian, represented a concealed conflict of interest that invalidated the conversion rights embedded in the lending agreement. He said Devereaux Capital was prepared to seek an injunction blocking any conversion attempt pending a full disclosure review. He said it all clearly and with conviction, and for the first several minutes it worked. The room was listening. Two of the board members were making notes. One of the directors at the far end of the table, a woman named Patricia Ossie, who had been on the board for 7 years and who Laurel had always found scrupulously fair, was reading the documents Harris had distributed with an expression that communicated genuine concern. Laurel watched Adrian. He had picked up the document now. He was reading it. She could see him processing the timeline, the dates of North Star's debt purchases against the dates of events in their marriage. The financial exposure figures next to periods she would have been present in his life. She watched him look at those numbers and slowly understand that they were real, that this was not a misunderstanding, that his wife had been doing something with his company's debt for nearly 2 years without his knowledge. He looked up at her. Is this true? The room went quiet. Laurel met his eyes. Yes, she said. Adrian stared at her. The Devereaux attorney was already moving to continue, sensing momentum, but Naomi spoke first. Before we go further, Naomi said, I'd like to ask Marcus Bell to display something for the board. Everyone turned toward Marcus. He had been seated near the end of the table, slightly removed from the main grouping. He was holding a closed folder. His expression gave away nothing, but his hands were very still. He looked at Laurel. She nodded once. He stood up, connected his laptop to the display system at the north wall, and began navigating to a file. The flat screen came to life. What appeared was not a presentation in any polished sense. No branded slides, no formatted graphs. It was a timeline document, clean and plain, built from Blackwood Hospitality's own internal financial records. Marcus had clearly prepared it in advance, which told Laurel something about how long he had been waiting for exactly this moment. 18 months ago, Marcus said, in the even voice of someone who has rehearsed this and is glad to finally be saying it aloud, Blackwood Hospitality's primary lender declined to extend our refinancing terms. The decision was communicated through standard channels and the reasoning was documented. Cash reserves at the time were insufficient to cover the shortfall. He advanced the slide. A distressed debt buyer acquired the position within 72 hours of the lender's withdrawal, at terms favorable enough to prevent an immediate liquidity event. He paused. That buyer was North Star Legacy Partners. He advanced again, 14 months ago. A construction financing partner pulled their commitment from the Midtown renovation project after a title dispute delayed the permits by 3 months. The gap was approximately $9 million. North Star provided a supplemental facility within 10 days. Another slide. 11 months ago, a large institutional investor declined to roll over their preferred position at the annual reset. The exit would have created a working capital shortage in the following quarter. North Star purchased the preferred units at full value. He moved through the timeline methodically, slide by slide, crisis by quiet crisis. The room was completely silent. Laurel watched the board members' faces change as the picture assembled itself. Patricia Osasi had stopped taking notes and was simply watching the screen. Robert Feld had his pen in his hand but was not moving it. Two other directors were looking between the screen and Laurel with a particular expression of people recalibrating something they thought they already understood. Adrian had not moved at all. He was sitting very still, looking at the timeline, and Laurel could see him remembering. She knew what he was doing because she knew how his mind worked. He was going back through each of those moments the way you go back through a series of events once you understand what was actually connecting them. She could almost track which memory he was in. The phone call from Marcus telling him the refinancing had somehow resolved. Adrian had called it a lucky break, had bought the team a celebratory dinner, had described the narrow escape to investors as evidence of the company's fundamentals being sound. The Midtown renovation gap. He had been genuinely stressed about that one, briefly. And then Marcus had brought him news that a credit facility had appeared, and he had not asked too many questions about why because good news arrived and you absorbed it and moved forward. The preferred unit situation. He had described that resolution at a dinner with Laurel, actually, the two of them at the kitchen table, and he had used the word finally about North Star's response. He had said he didn't know what made them so cooperative. Laurel remembered that dinner. She had passed him the bread, he had thanked her, and she had not said a single word about why North Star was cooperative. Marcus reached the end of the timeline and did not immediately sit down. He looked at the room. Every major liquidity event in the past 2 years was either cushioned or resolved by North Star, he said.
In my 11 years as CFO of this company,
I have never encountered a creditor who was more patient, more flexible, or more consistently willing to take terms that protected our operational capacity over their own short-term return. He closed the laptop. I tried to tell you 6 months ago that the Devereaux transaction was structured to exploit the gap between our current debt obligations and our perceived cash position. You told me to trust the process. He sat down. The room was very quiet. Camille was still. She had been listening to Marcus with the alert attention of someone tracking exactly how much damage was being done and running the math on whether it was recoverable. Laurel could see the calculation happening. Camille was smart. She would find the angle to shift this back. She found it. She leaned forward slightly and addressed the board with a voice carefully calibrated between professional concern and disappointed reason. Nothing Marcus has presented changes the core issue, she said. In fact, it confirms it. Someone with undisclosed access to this company's private financial information accumulated a creditor position over 2 years without disclosing the relationship. Whatever the motive, that's a conflict that has to be addressed before North Star can claim any enforcement rights. She turned toward Adrian. Adrian, the cleanest resolution here is to remove the conflict immediately. Ask Marcus to step back from the interim role. Let our team complete the documentation that was initiated last night and finalize the asset transfer. The Devereaux transaction is the bridge that gets Blackwood through this. Adrian did not respond immediately. Camille pressed. Every hour we delay adds uncertainty for the banking group. Our attorneys can have the supplemental transfer documentation filed within the hour. The 2 hotel properties moved to Devereaux Capital's holding structure. You retain operating control of the remaining portfolio, and the cash infusion covers your immediate obligations. She looked at Adrian with an expression built from patience and warmth, and the specific certainty of someone who has decided that the correct outcome of this meeting is the one she arrived with. It was, Laurel realized, the same expression she had been using on him for months. Then Camille made her mistake. She looked at the Devereaux attorney and gave him a small nod. Harris opened a second folder and produced an additional document. We've prepared the supplemental transfer authorization, he said. It covers the 2 Madison properties in the Midtown asset. Once executed, the transfer of all 3 becomes effective upon filing. The Midtown asset, that was not in the original agreement. Naomi caught it at the same moment Laurel did. Their eyes met briefly across the table. The original Devereaux transaction had covered the 2 Madison Avenue hotels. That was what Adrian had signed the previous night. The Midtown property had not been in the agreed scope. Including it in this supplemental authorization meant Camille was attempting to expand the transfer under pressure, using the urgency of the moment to move an additional protected asset without proper creditor approval. Naomi reached into her folder. She placed a document on the table in front of her. She slid it to the center where the whole room could see it. Article 12 of North Star's lending agreement, she said. Protected Asset Covenant. The Midtown property is specifically listed as a restricted asset. Any transfer of restricted assets without North Star's prior written consent constitutes an independent covenant breach. She looked at Harris calmly. Your client just attempted to facilitate a second breach in this boardroom while arguing that the first one invalidates our enforcement rights. The room absorbed that. Harris looked at the document. He looked at Camille. She was looking at the page in front of Naomi with an expression that had gone very flat. Robert Feld said, with the tone of someone whose patience had been in significant decline for the past 20 minutes, Mr. Harris, is your client aware that the Midtown property carries a restricted asset designation under the existing credit agreement? Harris said they would need a moment to review. Feld said they had been in this room for 40 minutes and suggested they should have reviewed before preparing the supplemental documentation. Adrian looked at the Devereaux's attorney. Then he looked at Camille. Something was moving across his face. Not anger exactly. Closer to the expression of someone who has been looking at a landscape for a long time and has just been handed a different map and is discovering that the two don't match. He turned toward the table. Who owns North Star? His voice was quiet, not loud, not sharp. Just the plain, flat version of a question asked by a man who has suddenly arrived at the place where the answer to that question changes what he thinks he knows about the last several years of his life. Silence spread across the boardroom. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Laurel reached forward. She took the conversion notice document she had carried into the room, face down, and placed it on the table. She looked at her husband. I do. Adrian stared at her. His mouth opened slightly. It was involuntary. The physical response of a mind receiving information the body isn't ready for. He looked at the document in front of her. He looked at Naomi. He looked back at Laurel. What do you mean, you do? My mother built North Star Legacy Partners over 20 years. She left it to me when she died. Laurel kept her voice even. There was no performance in it. This was not a moment she was enjoying. I rebuilt the fund over the following 2 years. I authorized the purchase of your company's distressed debt. I approved every extension and every restructuring term. When your lenders walked away, North Star was there because I put it there. Adrian sat back in his chair. He was trying to process it. She could see the pieces arriving in the wrong order and him trying to sort them. The years of boardroom conversations where North Star's name came up, and she sat across from him at dinner saying nothing. The descriptions he had given to journalists of the crisis years, language about his own leadership and his own instincts guiding the company through difficult stretches. The confidence he had built his public identity on. Camille's attorney started speaking. Naomi cut him off immediately. She laid out in crisp and sequential language exactly what North Star's position was. The debt was legitimately acquired at market terms. There was no improper use of non-public information. The acquisition had been documented with proper counsel at every stage. The conflict of interest allegation was constructed from accurate facts arranged into a false implication, and she would demonstrate that in any venue Devereaux Capital chose to contest it. One of the directors, a man named Greer, who had been quiet through the entire meeting, said he wanted to understand whether Laurel had disclosed her North Star position to Blackwood's board at any point during her marriage to the CEO. She had not. He said that was a problem. She said she understood that. Patricia Ossie said the more immediate problem was that Devereaux Capital had attempted to execute an unauthorized transfer in a board meeting while claiming the moral authority to critique someone else's disclosure practices. Greer and Ossie looked at each other. Camille's attorney was speaking again. He was saying that regardless of the covenant situation, Devereaux Capital was prepared to pursue litigation that could tie up North Star's enforcement rights for months. He was describing timelines and filing strategies and the practical reality of what extended litigation would do to Blackwood Hospitality's banking relationships. He was right about enough of it that the room listened. The company's primary bank had already sent a preliminary inquiry about the covenant breach. The revolving credit facility review was coming. Marcus estimated, in a voice stripped of everything except accuracy, that without access to that facility, Blackwood could not meet payroll beyond the next 3 to 4 weeks. 412 people. Week 2. Laurel looked at the conversion notice in front of her. Adrian was watching her. He had been watching her for the past several minutes with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not anger. She had seen his anger in many forms across 8 years. This was different. It was closer to the expression of someone who has discovered, in a very public room, that they fundamentally misunderstood a person they believed they knew completely, and are now rapidly and uncomfortably revising. He had needed her to be the woman who chose his name, and she had let him have that for years, because she understood that what she was had the power to diminish what he believed he was. She had made herself smaller so that his self-image could stay intact. And look where that had gotten both of them. She picked up the conversion notice. "I want to be clear," she said, addressing the room rather than any single person in it. "North Star activating conversion rights will create a control change signal for the banking group. The revolving facility will be reviewed and likely suspended during the review period. That is a real risk for this company's employees." She paused. "I am also aware that without a conversion notice filed today, Devereaux Capital's litigation strategy creates enough uncertainty to achieve the same result more slowly and more expensively. There is no path out of this room that doesn't have a cost." The room was listening. "I'm not converting this debt because I want to control Adrian's company," she said. "I don't want his company. I never wanted it. What I want is for 400 people who did their jobs and had nothing to do with any of this to receive their paychecks." She looked at the document in her hand. "I can arrange a bridge facility to cover the liquidity gap during the review period. It will cost me personally. I'm prepared to do it." Greer asked why she would do that after what had happened. Laurel looked at him. "Because the alternative is letting innocent people pay for what 3 adults did wrong," she said, "and I'm not willing to do that." She signed the conversion notice. One clean line, her full name, the date. She held it out to Naomi. Naomi took it. The room shifted. Directors were reaching for phones. The Devereaux attorneys were pulling back from the table, reconfiguring. Harris leaned toward Camille and said something in a low voice. Camille listened without moving. Then Camille looked at the attorneys, and they looked back at her, because what had just happened was not what she had planned for. She had planned for Laurel to be exposed and discredited. She had planned for Adrian to side with the transaction and for the board to feel the pressure of Devereaux Capital's litigation threat. She had not planned for North Star's principal to sit at that table and sign the conversion notice in front of everyone and simultaneously announce a bridge facility. She had not planned for someone to simply absorb the cost and move through it. She had planned for a woman who could be broken by enough pressure. She had not understood who she was planning against. Camille turned toward her brother's attorneys. She spoke quietly, but the room was quiet enough that fragments reached the table. She was asking about the litigation timeline. She was asking whether the injunction could still be filed. The older of the two attorneys said something that involved the word exposure. Camille pressed. The attorney shook his head slightly. Her brother Laurel had already confirmed through Naomi had declined to escalate. The acquisition was his company's business. The personal war was Camille's. And no CFO of Devereaux Capital was going to risk the firm's legal standing on a conflict that had already produced 2 covenant breaches, a signed conversion notice, and a boardroom full of witnesses to the supplemental authorization attempt. Camille understood that before the attorney finished talking. Laurel watched her understand it. The smile that had been Camille's constant feature in every room Laurel had seen her in, polished and patient and positioned like a weapon, was gone. What was underneath it was not dramatic, no visible collapse. Just the flat, altered face of someone who has run out of useful moves and knows it. Adrian stood up from the table. He was not looking at Camille, he was looking at his wife. Laurel was capping her pen. She handed the conversion notice to Naomi and began organizing the documents in front of her. She was calm and unhurried and completely focused on what she was doing. And Adrian stood at the head of the table and watched her with an expression Laurel did not look up to see. She did not need to. She could feel the weight of it from across the room. He had understood something. It had taken a boardroom and a timeline and a conversion notice and a woman signing her own name to a document that cost her significantly, but he had finally understood. She had held enough power to dismantle what he believed was his greatest achievement. She had held it for nearly 2 years, and she had never once used it. Not when he excluded her, not when he dismissed her, not when he made her smaller in conversation so that his own image could stay larger. Not even when he put another woman's necklace around another woman's neck and sent footage of the moment across the entire city. She had used it now, finally, and she had not used it against him. She had used it for the people who had nothing to do with any of it. Naomi stood and gathered her materials. She caught Laurel's eye. Laurel nodded, finished, and rose from the chair. Marcus Bell caught her gaze as she stood. He gave her one brief nod. Not theatrical, just acknowledgement from one person to another of something that had needed to happen for a long time. Laurel picked up her phone and walked toward the boardroom door. She passed Adrian on her way out. She did not stop. He did not stop her. But she felt him turn as she passed, tracking her movement, and she understood that whatever the conversation was that still needed to happen between them, it was not this room and it was not today. Today was finished. She walked down the corridor toward the elevator and did not look back. Devereaux Capital's offices were on the 44th floor of a building in Midtown, the kind of space designed to communicate that the people inside it made important decisions. Floor-to-ceiling glass, a reception area with a single long desk and nothing on it. Art on the walls that cost enough to be a statement. Laurel arrived with Naomi and Marcus. No security, no extra attorneys. She had told Naomi they didn't need to perform strength. The documents would do that. Camille was already in the conference room. She had brought two attorneys and her older brother, Thomas Devereaux, who sat at the far end of the table with the careful stillness of a man who had been told enough about the situation to be concerned, but not enough to be fully in control of it. Camille stood when Laurel entered, a small, deliberate gesture, taking the room before anyone else could. She opened with the lawsuit. She laid it out calmly, the way people lay things out when they want to demonstrate that they've already made a decision and are simply informing you of it. The allegation of undisclosed conflict of interest, the filing timeline, the months of litigation that would create enough uncertainty around Northstar's enforcement rights to functionally paralyze the conversion. She said all of it looking directly at Laurel. Laurel sat down. She waited for Camille to finish. Then she said, "Before we discuss legal strategy, I want to clear something up." Camille waited. "You've been arguing," Laurel said, "that Adrian was manipulated into signing the Devereaux agreement, that he didn't understand the terms, that someone took advantage of his trust." She folded her hands on the table. "Is that the position you want to take?" "I'm saying the transaction was legitimate," Camille said carefully. "Good, then we agree." Laurel met her eyes. "You're right. Adrian made his own choices." A brief silence. Camille's expression shifted slightly. The agreement had come too easily, and she knew it. Marcus opened his folder. What followed was not dramatic. It was methodical, which turned out to be worse. He walked through the Devereaux valuation documentation against independent appraisals of the two Madison Avenue hotels. He showed the gap between what Devereaux Capital had presented to Adrian and what the properties had been separately assessed at by two different firms in the past 18 months. He showed the representations made to Blackwood's creditors during the financing process. He showed where those representations conflicted with valuation Devereaux Capital had used in the acquisition structure. Thomas Devereaux stopped looking at the table and started looking at his sister. Camille kept her expression neutral. She was working hard at it. Then Marcus placed the supplemental transfer document on the table. The one Camille's attorney had produced in the boardroom the day before. The Midtown property inclusion. This authorization was presented in a board meeting, while Devereaux Capital was simultaneously arguing that Northstar's enforcement rights were invalid, Marcus said. It attempted to transfer a restricted asset without creditor consent. That's the second covenant breach in 18 hours, both of them directly facilitated by your client. Thomas Devereaux said something under his breath to the attorney beside him. Camille turned toward her brother. "We can still file. The timeline I described gives us..." "Camille." His voice was quiet and specific, the voice of someone who has decided. She stopped. He looked at his attorney. They had a short, low conversation that Laurel could not fully hear but did not need to. She had spoken to Naomi about Thomas Devereaux's position earlier that morning. He was a careful businessman who had built something real over 2 decades. He had allowed his sister's access to Adrian to become a business opportunity. He had not planned for it to become a liability. 2 covenant breaches, documented in a board meeting with witnesses. His firm's name attached to a valuation strategy that conflicted with creditor representations. An attempted unauthorized asset transfer that was on the record. Thomas Devereaux was not going to sacrifice what he had built. When the short conversation with the attorney ended, he sat back in his chair. He looked at Camille with the expression of an older sibling who has spent years trying to account for a younger one's tendencies and has finally run out of runway. Camille recognized it. Laurel watched her recognize it. This had always been Camille's real exposure, not the legal risk, not the financial complexity, not even losing Adrian. Camille had positioned herself as someone capable of delivering a strategic prize to her family's institution. She had structured her entire approach around that outcome. The affair gave her access. The manipulation gave her influence. The acquisition was supposed to be the proof that the Devereaux family's investment in her judgment was worth it. Instead, she had accelerated a deal that should never have been rushed. She had pushed Adrian to sign supplemental documentation in the middle of a crisis she was partly responsible for creating. And in trying to destroy Laurel's position publicly, she had made moves in a boardroom that were now documented and witnessed. She had not been defeated from outside. She had moved too fast and defeated herself. Laurel looked at her across the table. "You thought winning Adrian meant winning his company," she said. "Those were never the same thing." Camille said nothing. Thomas Devereaux asked his attorney to begin preparing withdrawal documentation. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. They did not shake hands on the way out. Stopping Camille did not save Blackwood hospitality. Laurel understood this before she left the Devereaux Capitol building. The conversion notice was filed. The bank's monitoring system had already flagged the covenant breach. By the following morning, the revolving credit facility was suspended pending a control change review. The liquidity gap was real and immediate. The board convened again 2 days later, smaller this time. No opposing attorneys, no crisis energy. Just the practical, exhausted conversation of people trying to find a way through a problem that had no clean exits. The simplest proposal came from a director named Greer. Sell the remaining hotel on the Midtown portfolio, the one that wasn't in the Devereaux agreement. It would generate enough cash to cover the working capital shortfall, satisfy the bank, and give the company stable footing while the leadership restructuring settled. Marcus put the employment impact on the screen. 206 jobs at that property. The room went quiet. Laurel said no. Greer asked what the alternative was. Naomi presented it. North Star held a commercial real estate position unrelated to Blackwood hospitality. A performing asset well managed with significant projected appreciation over the next 5 years. Selling a portion of it at current market value would generate a bridge facility large enough to stabilize Blackwood through the bank review without layoffs. Greer asked who owned that position. Naomi said North Star's principal did, personally. He looked at Laurel. Sarah Cho had run the numbers 3 different ways. Best case, Laurel would recover approximately 60 cents on the dollar over 10 years compared to what the position would likely return if she held it. The honest version of the math, which Sarah presented without softening it, was that this decision would cost Laurel somewhere between $30 and $50 million in future value. Laurel told Sarah to prepare the sale documentation. The room absorbed that. Adrian had been sitting near the end of the table, in a chair that was technically a board member's seat, but not the CEO chair. He had been quiet through most of the meeting. When Laurel said she would sell the position, he spoke. He said he wanted to contribute his personal assets to the bridge. He had liquidity from personal investments, he said. Significant liquidity. He could cover a substantial portion of the shortfall and reduce Laurel's exposure. She looked at him. No, she said. He started to explain. She stopped him. Adrian, she kept her voice even. I know why you're offering. I understand what you're trying to do. But writing a check right now doesn't fix what happened. It just makes you feel like it does. She paused. Your money is not the answer I need from you. He sat back. 2 directors were looking at their hands. She looked at the room. What this company needs is stability, clear governance, leadership that the banking group and the remaining investors can trust. She turned to Marcus. I'm recommending Marcus Bell as interim CEO pending a proper search. He's been the most reliable person in this building for 11 years, and he deserves the role he should have been offered a long time ago. Marcus looked at the table. He cleared his throat once. I also think, Laurel continued, that the board needs to hear from Adrian on the question of his current role. Everyone turned toward Adrian. He was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened in his chair. He called for a board vote on his resignation as CEO, effective immediately. He said it plainly, without a prepared speech. He said the Devereaux transaction was his decision, and the responsibility for its consequences belonged to him. He said Marcus was the right person to lead the company through restructuring. Nobody had required this. Laurel had not asked for it. Patricia Ossie said they would need to formally accept the resignation and move to begin that process. It passed unanimously. Adrian voted in favor of his own removal. Afterward, Laurel stood in the corridor outside the boardroom while Marcus spoke with 2 of the directors inside. Through the glass wall, she could see Adrian still at the table, alone, looking at the skyline with an expression she had no easy word for. She had spent months wondering whether the person she had married was still somewhere inside the person he had become. Watching him vote to remove himself from the company that was the center of his identity, with no lawyers forcing it and no public audience requiring it, she had the first small, uncertain thought that maybe he was. She did not allow herself to stay with that thought for long. She went back to work. The townhouse in Brooklyn Heights had a front stoop with 6 steps and a black iron railing that was slightly loose on the left side. The neighborhood was quiet in the evenings, old trees lining the sidewalk, brownstones with good bones, the kind of block where people walked dogs after dinner and nodded at each other without stopping. Laurel had been there for 6 weeks. She was 34 weeks along when Adrian rang the bell on a Saturday afternoon in late October. She saw him through the window before she opened the door. He was standing on the stoop in a coat she recognized, wearing no expression in particular. No car at the curb, no driver waiting, no flowers. He was holding a small folder. She opened the door. He did not ask to come in. He stood on the stoop and said he wanted to show her something. She stepped aside to let him enter, and he sat at the kitchen table without being invited. The way people sit when they've been in a place enough times that the habit is still there, even when the belonging isn't. She sat across from him. He opened the folder. It was a single document, a receipt from a charitable transaction. He had sold the diamond necklace. The proceeds, Laurel saw when she read the amount, had been directed to the Employee Assistance Fund established for Blackwood hospitality workers affected by the restructuring. She looked at the receipt for a moment. Then she looked at him. "A donation doesn't repair a marriage," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not why I did it." She waited. He said, "I did it because it needed to stop existing." She put the receipt down. He folded his hands on the table. He was not performing composure. She could see that it cost him something to sit in this kitchen, across from her, without the architecture of a speech or a strategy, or a prepared set of talking points to hide behind. He said, "I didn't only betray you when I was with Camille." She looked at him. "I betrayed you every time I interpreted your patience as weakness," he said. "Every time someone in a room praised me and I stood there absorbing it while you were standing right there, knowing things about my own company I had never figured out myself." He paused. "Every time I let myself believe you needed my name more than I needed your honesty." The kitchen was very quiet. She let what he said stay in the room without rushing past it. Then she said, "I'm not without fault in this." He looked at her. "Secretly saving your company wasn't entirely noble," she said. "Part of it was fear. I knew how much your self-image was built around what you had built alone. I was afraid that if you found out how often I had caught you, you would resent me for it." She looked at the table. "So I protected your pride, and I let it grow into something I didn't recognize anymore. I helped build the version of you that Camille found." He was very still. "We both made each other possible," she said. "The worst versions of each other." A long silence. Outside on the street, someone passed with a dog, footsteps clear on the sidewalk. Adrian said, "Can we start over?" Laurel looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "Not yet." He absorbed that. He did not argue it. Then he asked her something different. "Can I start by becoming the kind of father our daughter deserves?" The question was smaller than the first one, more honest. It wasn't asking for the marriage back. It wasn't asking for forgiveness or restoration or credit. It was asking for one specific thing that was actually within reach. Laurel looked at her husband. She said, "You can try." Blackwood hospitality stabilized over the following months. Not dramatically, not with a press release or a triumphant fourth quarter report. Just the slow, patient work of a company finding its footing under leadership that had earned the room's trust. Marcus Bell was confirmed as CEO after a formal search that, as Laurel had privately expected, turned up no better option than the one already there. He accepted the role with the same quiet competence he had brought to every room for 11 years. The banking group restored the revolving credit facility in the 8th week. Payroll was never missed. North Star remained an investor, but Laurel spent 3 months working with outside counsel to build a governance structure that created a clear, documented separation between her personal relationship with Adrian and any future corporate decisions. It was thorough and it was public and it was, she told Naomi, the thing she should have done first. Naomi said better late than never. Laurel said she supposed. Adrian did not ask for his CEO title back. He built his days differently that season. He showed up to board meetings he was invited to, but did not dominate them. He attended events in his capacity as a shareholder rather than as the face of the company. He stopped giving interviews. He showed up for Laurel, not loudly, not with gestures designed to be seen. He was simply present, consistently, in the ordinary ways that don't film well and can't be announced. He drove her to appointments. He assembled furniture for the nursery on a Sunday afternoon without making it a moment. He called when he said he would call. Their daughter was born on a Thursday in December.
7 pounds, 4 ounces.
A full head of dark hair. An expression of profound displeasure at the general situation. Laurel held her for the first hour and did not think about North Star or Devereaux Capital or boardrooms or the 12 seconds of video that had crossed 11,000 screens on a Tuesday morning in October. She thought about her mother. She thought about the margin note in the old folder. The question is never whether you can afford the risk. She thought the answer now was that she could. Several months after the birth, on an evening when the light was still in the sky past 7, and the city felt like it had exhaled after a long winter, Laurel sat alone at a table in a small restaurant 3 blocks from the Brooklyn Heights townhouse. The baby was home with a sitter. The dinner was a deliberate thing. Time to herself. Time to sit in a room with good food and no agenda. Adrian appeared at the edge of her table. He had walked from somewhere nearby. No coat, despite the weather still being cool, which was so characteristic of him she almost smiled. He was standing at a slight distance, not pulling out the chair, not assuming. He looked at the empty chair beside her. "May I sit?" he said. Laurel looked at him. She saw the coat he hadn't worn, the folder he wasn't carrying, the speech he wasn't prepared to give. She saw the face of a man who had, over the past several months, made a sustained and quiet and unannounced effort to become someone who might deserve to ask that question. She reached over and moved the chair slightly toward him. "You can sit," she said. "It was not forgiveness. It was not a promise. But after everything they had each built and broken and rebuilt alone, after the champagne glasses and boardrooms and signed documents and diamond necklaces and late nights and long silences, after all of it, it was the one thing neither of them could purchase. A beginning.